Hello and welcome to Dialogue. I'm Yang Rui. Relations between Turkey and Russia have plummeted after the Turkish Air Force shot down a Russian jet on November 24th, claiming it had violated Turkish airspace, whereas Moscow insisted that the Su-24 had not crossed into Turkey. Following the incident, Russia imposed sanctions against Turkey and deployed S-400 missiles at a Russian Air Force base in Syria. Then, just 2 months later, Turkey said that the Russian Su-34 had again violated Turkey's airspace and summoned the Russian ambassador to Ankara late Friday. But the claim was immediately denied by Russia. So will there be another round of bellicose words between Russia and Turkey? Or worse still, are the two countries in danger of starting a real war? Russia and Turkey, Putin and Erdogan, what do they really want? To discuss these issues, I'm joined in the studio by Robert Cab, Director of the Economist Corporate Network, and Hua Liming, who is a Senior Research Fellow of China Institute of International Studies. But before we get started, let's take a look at this background report.
Warning Moscow that it would face consequences, Turkey has said a Russian Su-34 plane violated Turkish airspace at Friday noon local time. Turkish President Tayyip Erdogan condemned the alleged incursion.
These irresponsible steps do not help the Russian Federation, NATO-Russia relations, or regional and global peace. On the contrary, they are detrimental.
The Russian Defense Ministry has denied Ankara's claims. Tensions have been escalating between the two countries since the downing of another Russian jet by the Turkish army in November. Meanwhile, Russian jets have flown thousands of missions over the sky above Syria for 4 months. Moscow says they've made a big difference.
The actions of the Russian air forces in response to the request of the Syrian government really helped to change the situation in the country and reduce the territory occupied by terrorists.
Washington and its regional ally Turkey have accused Moscow of attacking the US-backed oppositions who are fighting the Syrian government. It has been reported that the rebels have suffered significant setbacks in recent months. Syrian government forces have retaken key towns. Meanwhile, Russian airstrikes have hit targets across Syria and have appeared to be more intense than the US-led coalition strikes against the ISIL-held areas. Russian actions appear to have helped civilians too. Humanitarian aid, dropped over one town in mid-January, gave relief to 250,000 people who had been surrounded by ISIL forces for months.
Gentlemen, do you think Russia and Turkey are in real danger of starting a real war?
I wouldn't say they are hostile to each other, but at least they don't have common enemy. Because it would have been a big question, because ISIS should be the common enemy of Russia and Turkey. And Bashar Assad should not be the question. But today, the dispute between Russia and Turkey is not ISIS, it's that Assad, whether Bashar Assad should go or stay in. So that's not the question, bilateral question between Russia and Turkey. It's a problem of regional geopolitical. So it's very difficult to say they are friendly countries as they used to have 30 years or 20 years before.
But you didn't say directly whether they will be involved in a real war, an open confrontation militarily. Why are you so cautious?
I don't think they will have a kind of war between themselves, because Russia doesn't have the political will, and nor it has the capability to have a war with Turkey.
Once hostilities were to break out, the situation is likely to spin out of control. I mean, that could be the logic that all wars followed before. What do you think of the real danger?
I would agree with the ambassador. I think that both sides don't have an interest in open conflict. Russia's got enough to deal with in Ukraine, and it certainly has enough to deal with in terms of sanctions from the West and other geopolitical issues. Moreover, Turkey is still a NATO member, and if it were to engage Turkey in outright warfare, that would bring about the wrath of NATO. I mean, it's the last thing Russia really wants, I think.
It doesn't come as a surprise that the Russian jet would violate the airspace of whatever countries. It occurs before. It occurred before and it will occur in the future. So this went back to what happened last year when the tensions between the two countries mounted sharply after a Soviet jet was downed. Now, do you think President Erdogan had reacted excessively? He had overreacted to the alleged violation of the airspace of Turkey. Don't you think he should have done or employed other means, for example, to escort the Russian jet out of its airspace instead of shooting it down?
It was just an excuse for President Erdogan, because the violation of airspace happens between two neighboring countries. If the bilateral relation is friendly, I don't think it's a problem. Just say hello and warn it, that's all. But it became an excuse for Erdogan to fight against Russia and to demonize Russia in the international community.
Is it for domestic political reasons for him to look tough in the standoff against Russia?
I think inside Turkey there is a strong nationalism against Russia. But there are other priorities for President Erdogan. He has Kurdish problems, he has economy, he has other problems, election. So I don't think the Russian relationship is priority of President Erdogan. So this is quite a risky policy for him.
And Robert, don't you think Ankara shares the same concern with the United States about the indiscriminate bombing of all the opposition forces inside Syria? Russians seem not only just target ISIL or Daesh in the volatile region of Syria, the civil strife, it also targeted all the opposition forces, some of which were actually supported by the West.
Yeah, I think the latter is closer to the Washington interpretation of what's happening. They see this as a Russian excuse to go in and knock out pro-Western rebel groups, for as few as they are, and that's been one of the biggest issues for the West in finding a solution to Syria. There haven't been many cohesive pro-Western or at least more neutrally viewed groups to support. However, it does seem to be, according to the NATO interpretation of things, that Russia has been targeting these groups that are not only anti-ISIS, but also anti-Assad.
Why did Russia decide to step in directly September the 30th last year militarily to openly intervene with the civil strife in Syria? I mean, this is indeed a bold move, far and wide. If you look at the poor economic performance of Russia and the lingering economic sanctions that were imposed by the West following takeover of Crimea.
In terms, in terms of the Syrian issue, I think the Russians' target was very clear. It was going to keep Bashar al-Assad regime. And because Bashar al-Assad was in very difficult position without the assistance of Russia. Of course, for Russia, geopolitical and strategic purposes, I think it's a package between Syria and Ukraine. It's a big package, and maybe it's a big deal between the US and Russia.
Well, this is a very interesting phenomenon, isn't it? That over the past 5 centuries, 10 wars occurred between Turkey and Russia. And there could be an 11th war where the two sides are unable to handle the crisis properly with the help of the United States and the West. The Turkish Air Force has reportedly raised the alert level at its air bases to an orange warning. I wonder if this is the highest level of a warning, and authorized pilots to shoot down any aircraft which are out of order in the case of airspace violation. The first incursion in November reportedly lasted for less than half a minute. Even if Russian warplanes cross into Turkey, is it really necessary to shoot them down? I mean, given the bitter lesson of the first shooting down, why do you think President Erdogan showed no signs of weakness? He showed no signs to be the first to blink in the standoff.
Or relenting. Well, I think it's exactly that. It's that what we would maybe consider a more moderate approach. I think both sides, you have two individuals, Putin and Erdogan, who play to a political base that demands they look strong and indefeatable. So in that context, to do anything in terms of what we would consider more compromising or moderation would be viewed as weakness to the political power base they rely on. I think that's what's playing in here. Unfortunately, it means very negative consequences for international relations and the two countries' relations themselves. But for the region itself, it's destabilizing to have that degree of tension just added on top of all the issues that are happening with ISIS and Syria overall.
Now, gentlemen, I have a big question as to the relationship between Turkey and Europe. Given the fact that the euro is plummeting against the US dollars and the economy is not in a very good shape, and you're from the Economist Group, and although NATO has called on Russia to act responsibly, and it is likely to invoke Article 5 to defend its ally, Turkey, if Russians retaliated after yet another fighter jet were to be shot down. So, how likely is it for NATO to step in? In fact, Turkey has been rejected politely by the European Union to grant its full membership. European Union does need Russia to fight Daesh. And particularly after the terrorist attacks in Paris last year, President Hollande must have aligned himself with Putin in fighting and pushing back the Islamic extremism. So, given such complexities, do you think NATO is ready to invoke Article 5, whatever the costs?
I think that NATO's statement just a political gesture, that nothing more than that, because NATO today is not in a position to have a war in Middle East. Even they were reluctant to send troops to Afghanistan, to Iraq, to assist the United States to fight in those countries. How can they today to have military assistance to Turkey? I don't believe that. But they had to make this political gesture, and nothing more than that.
And because perhaps Turkey has made tremendous contributions to, for example, the composition of a rapid response forces that was formed by NATO as part of its commitment and mandate as a member of NATO. For the past few years, let's look at President Assad and in the future, because there is an ongoing peace talks in Vienna, which involves many opposition forces. By the way, it's very, very difficult to define who's who. We have too many ragtag opposition groups in Syria. Many of them have been invited to attend the peace conference in Vienna. One of the critical issues is what's going to happen to President Assad once a political process were to be embarked upon following the peace talks in Vienna. So what's your immediate response? What was the response that crossed your mind upon the mere mention of President Assad?
The immediate result of Russian intervention, military intervention, is that Bashar Assad is going to stay. He's not gone to have to go, because he has kept, and the Russians' target was that. Now the problem is that how can we start a certain political course to have a peaceful or political settlement of a Syrian issue? That's a problem. From one side, the Syrian government is clear because of Bashar Assad. From the other side, more than 100 opposition groups are in the other side, and nobody knows who is the opposition. I think I remember once the Russian foreign minister Lavrov, he asked, who is the opposition? Who is the Syrian opposition? Nobody can answer the question.
Well, that's very interesting. Do you think this is also a very embarrassing issue for Washington to clarify who's who? And therefore, it's very difficult for them to study seriously whether a kind of alliance could be forged to fight the common enemy of Daesh and the opposition forces in Syria.
I don't know if it's so much a sense of embarrassment right now, but looking at it longitudinally from a few years back when President Obama was making statements that it's not a matter of if, but when for the Assad regime. talking about supporting rebel groups. And this is before people started talking about Daesh, ISIL, ISIS, the group that since emerged and is now seen as even worse than Assad himself, and has created, in fact, more destabilizing activity, not only in the Middle East, but also in Europe through terrorist activity. So, you know, if there is some sort of reflection going on in Washington, I would like to think they're getting used to looking at the difficulty of this problem with more of the complexity it deserves.
Thank you very much. You are watching Dialogue with Ambassador Hua Liming and Mr. Robert Cab. We are looking at the peace talk in Vienna about the future of Syria and about the current counterterrorism war on the front of Syria. We'll be back in a short while. Stay with us. Welcome back. I have to correct a little mistake that I made earlier. In fact, the venue for this peace talk occurred in Geneva instead of Vienna. Having said this, given the urgency of fighting the common enemy of Daesh in the Middle East, do you think the departure of President Assad is no longer the most important prerequisite for any forms of peace talks for the European Union? And therefore, they have to give a second thought as to the future of President Assad and all the political forces and tribes that he represents.
I remember 5 years before, when the anti-Assad demonstrations started in Damascus. First of all, Washington and all the European capital announced that Bashar al-Assad is illegal, so it should step down.
Yeah.
But after 5 years, suddenly they found this is not the priority of them. Priority is ISIS. The terrorists now is attacking in Paris, and they have the attacks in the United States. So I think for the time being, I think there could have been some deal between US and Russia that Bashar al-Assad is not the priority. It could be kept for a time, but now all the forces should be united to fight against ISIS. I think for the time being is the deal.
Now that the embattled European Union is licking wounds arising from the tidal waves of migration, asylum seeking from war-torn countries like Iraq and Syria, do you think they are clearly aware of the consequences of encouraging the enlargement of the civil strife in Syria, and they want to sort of limit the scale of the bloody conflict by involving as many opposition forces as possible in the peace talks?
Well, I'm not sure about their specific policy for opposition groups, but undeniably your point about wanting to limit civil strife in the Middle East has been a new realization for the Western powers, particularly EU member states, because of the refugee crisis that has emerged. A few years back, the Arab Spring was celebrated. Now we're seeing chaos from Iraq to Syria, Libya, all these places. It isn't going the way the Western powers were hoping. And the refugee crisis is really putting home the message that civil instability in the Middle East is not at all good right now for Western interests.
Right. There have been allegations, Ambassador Hua, that the President Erdogan wants to be Putin in Turkey, and that means a lot for the holding on to the power of the presidency, as opposed to a very strong parliamentary political system that was in fact designed by the first constitution that was adopted at the beginning of last century by President Kemal, who urged this country to go secular, and therefore he laid the groundwork for having a strong parliament instead of encouraging strong presidency. However, after winning the campaign in the presidential race, it seems Mr. Erdogan, who was the prime minister for 11 years, has changed his mind. He wanted very much to consolidate the power base of the presidency, and that's quite against the military force, whose aim is to maintain the results and outcome of the secular revolution that was initiated by the founding father of modern Turkey, Mr. Kemal. So what do you think of the domestic politics of Mr. Erdogan and his agenda?
I should say Erdogan was a quite successful politician in Turkey, and he's stronger than his predecessors in Turkey. and he improved the Turkish economy since 2002 when he became prime minister. And he had a very successful foreign policy. We remember Turkey was very proud to say Turkey has zero problem with all its neighbors. But now the policy is changing, both domestically and its foreign policy. Domestically, I think Erdogan is going to be to gradually change the constitution just to fit personally himself. When he was prime minister was the strongest man according to the constitution. Now he wants to amend the constitution, make the president the most powerful man in Turkey.
Will that be accepted by the electorate?
And the most important that he neutralized the military role in Turkish history. Because in Turkish history, since the Second World War, military played a very essential and important role. But he amended the constitution, and the military forces today in Turkey is no more playing a very key role in Turkish politics today.
What do you think of the complexities in Turkish domestic politics?
Well, it's interesting the way you laid it out, because Kemal Ataturk, the founder of the secular state of Turkey, was responding with military backing to the remnants of the Ottoman Empire. And you now see with someone like Erdogan this attempt, as you were laying out there, to consolidate power around the presidency. And he himself, while having modernized Turkey in many ways, is identified with Islamic sentiments, and he supports a more Islamic orientation for Turkish society, moving it away from the secular state. So it's interesting, he's a strong man like Ataturk, but he's actually, in fact, moving Turkey in a different direction, and indeed neutralizing the military in the process. So it's a very different dynamic. It's not boding well for Turkey's prospects if it wants to do things like join the EU. That direction will not let it get in unless they go back to a secular orientation.
Well, the refugee crisis in Europe may have made the problem even worse or make the future of joining the EU more difficult. Don't you think so, Ambassador Hua?
Well, Turkish actually have the more serious refugee problem.
2 million of them have been
2
staying
million.
in Turkey, and it's a very difficult task for
So the
President Erdogan.
1 million refugee for Europeans, I think in comparison with Turkey and Turkey's neighbor, Jordan, the Lebanon, it's just 5 million population, but has 1 million refugees in Lebanon.
That's 1/5 of the total population.
Every 5 people have 1 refugee. So I think that the problems, the spill out of problem for Syrian neighbors are much more serious than those happens today in Europe.
Well, this is the most devastating crisis that besets the Schengen Agreement and all the partners of this agreement, because some of the European Union member states have decided to close their borders to prevent the free movement of human resources. What about the impact of the current tensions between Saudi Arabia and Iran upon the relationship between Moscow and Ankara? Perhaps Ambassador Hua, you're in a better position to give an insightful look at whether it's more difficult for Erdogan to extract himself from the mire that he has with Moscow after Saudi Arabia decided to sever some diplomatic ties with Tehran.
Turkey doesn't have very hostile relation with Iran, but they are not as friendly as they used to have before 5 years because of the Syria. Now everything focusing on Syria. The deterioration of relations between Saudi Arabia and Iran is triggered from Syria issue, and the Turkish problem with Iran and Turkish foreign policy triggered from the Syrian problem. So as long as the war in Syria doesn't settle, I think that all the problems between the regional powers will be continued.
Perhaps the most thorny issue for President Erdogan at this moment is the future of Kurdistan, quote unquote. Kurdistan is actually the political ambition of the PKK, of the public enemy number one for Ankara, which the PKK demands the eventual independence for Kurds. It's very much like our fear about the Tibetan independence, the independence of Uyghur Islamic, Turkestan Islamic movement in Xinjiang. So someone would say, Ambassador Hua and Mr. Robert, Mr. Cap, that Kurds are actually the only winner of the Arab Spring and the chaos in Syria, because there's already a high degree of autonomy for Kurds in northern Iraq. There's already an independent autonomous region of Kurds inside Syria. And it'll be a nightmare for President Erdogan to have these Kurds united together and form their own Kurdistan. Don't you think this will be the worst case scenario for Ankara? And therefore, it doesn't come as a surprise for President Putin to call for Kurds to be involved in the peace process, to the dismay of Ankara.
Kurdish people inside Syria was the weakest Kurdish community between the Middle East Kurdish people, the Iraqi Kurdish, Iranian Kurdish, and Turkish Kurdish. But now, after the civil war started in Syria, now the Kurdish people are being used by Bashar al-Assad to fight against ISIS and to fight against the position. So I think that the Syrian Kurdish people now are much more benefited from this war. Of course, the Iraqi Kurdish, they have been benefited from the US invasion against Iraq already, because actually Iraqi Kurdistan now is almost a semi-independent state.
Perhaps the benefits of Iraqi Kurds actually started from the end of the first Gulf War in 1991, when no-fly zone was imposed by NATO, by the US-led coalition forces or coalition forces of the willing, and they have benefited from this enormously, since they occupy the oil-rich area in northern Iraq. Well, what do you think?
Well, if I may, I take your point in a political sense, the benefit, but the Turkish people have made tremendous sacrifices and suffered huge losses. I mean, going back to the Gulf War, they were gassed by the Saddam regime. So, it's really been a difficult journey for them to get where they are today. However, indeed, the net effect has been that it has strengthened the notion of a Kurdish state. And so that stretches across the geographies that the ambassador was just mentioning, including, of course, the problem for Erdogan. Southeastern Turkey has this large Turkish population. They've been united through the strife in the surrounding countries.
Okay, thank you very much. With that, we come to the end of this edition dialogue addressing the current relationship, the strained relationship between Moscow and Ankara after warnings given to Russian military that if they were to violate the airspace of Ankara, they're going to be shut down. I'll see you next time. Until then, goodbye.